what are Power Platform environments? How should you handle the default environment? Where do solutions come into it? What environment strategy should you implement? Should everyone be licensed? Josh and I are going to cover these questions and more in our debut video from Power Squared in discussion. Are you ready to go?
I'm ready, yeah. Let's give it a go.
All right, Josh. So the very first question I want to ask you, in Power Platform, what is an environment?
A good starting point, Charles. So an environment in Power Platform, let me try and explain it in a very simple manner. It's like a workspace for your kind of like data apps and flows. It's an isolated area for all of those things. So, you create almost like a boundary of separation for all of those components that you're building within Power Platform. It also means that, if you're building in one environment, that's not going to interfere with something else in another environment, meaning everything's separated, and, good to go from that standpoint. There are a number of environment types, which I think is important for us to kind of talk about and just kind of highlight as we're talking about kind of environments and the kind of very basics. We've got production environments, which are our, as it says on the tin, right, our production main live business environment, everything that's business critical. We've got sandbox environments, which are more for testing and experimentation type workloads before getting into production, usually. We've got trial environments, which is usually 30-day limited environments for just testing, that kind of thing, more premium features. And we've got personal developer environments, which again kind of does what it says on the tin. That's for an individual, for personal development, training. They're not generally time limited, so you can kind of play around with all of the components within Power Platform in that environment. And then we have the default environment, which I think I'll pass the baton on to you to maybe explain about, because that's quite an interesting one, right? What the default environment is.
Yeah, very interesting one. So the default environment's not a type of environment. I guess that's the first thing. So it is a production environment, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And the default environment is given to every tenant, every organization. And it's where everything's going to go by default unless you do something differently. So unless you try and build something outside of the default environment, by default, it's going to put you there unless you've got something like environment routing turned on where it'll take you away from the default environment. And the default environment is integrated across lots of the tools in Microsoft 365, right? So if you're in SharePoint and you want to build a customized form that will be a Power App, that will automatically get put into your default environment. There are other bits and pieces like the M365 agents, I think, possibly go into your default environment. There's something else I'm not thinking of. What else goes in the default environment from other tools?
I think some of the planner stuff goes in there, doesn't it? I'm sure.
Possibly.
I've seen that in the past. There's lots of things that go on and happen in the default environment, right? It's quite a minefield of components and solutions. Typically, it's definitely an interesting one. The key thing is, you've probably seen it as well, and when you start looking into it, is how unorganized and messy the default environment can be, right? It has a lot of interesting things going on. So does that lead us on to maybe our kind of first topical question of the day, which is how do we govern this? Do you want to kind of start, or how we can maybe look at governing some of these environments and then start to come up with a strategy?
Yeah, so I think one of the things to consider is if you're starting off fresh, your consideration is, should I let people build things in this default environment, and what should I let them build in it? So often we would rename the default environment to something like personal productivity or productivity, and it would be a space for people to create productivity tools for themselves. So if I wanted to create a flow that sends me a reminder email when something happens, something along those lines, that seems like the perfect place for it. And if you keep it limited to those personal productivity apps and flows, then it keeps it very straightforward and very simple. But let's say that you've already got an organization that's been using Power Platform for a while. You've probably got loads of things in there. You've potentially got, maybe there's a Canvas app in there with SharePoint lists as the data source, and it's being used by 300 people, but it's also being shared by with the entire organization. That kind of thing comes along very often when you haven't looked into Power Platform, but you've been letting people use it. So then it's a case of trying to govern what you've got and start to put in place restrictions on people and give them freedom where they should have freedom. So you don't want people doing everything in that default environment. So I guess the first thing that we're saying is rename it to something like personal productivity or productivity, and then look at what's in there. What are people building? And if they shouldn't be building it in there, then you want a plan to get that out of there and get it to a place where it should be, which would be in a separate environment.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. I think, we see it time and time again. The default environment just is a mess of things. So getting some purpose around it, renaming it, and just starting to kind of get a handle of what's going on. It generally, for most people, it's the first kind of entry point into, if they're building, let's say, a Canvas app or a Power Automate workflow, they won't even realize that they're in the default environment, and they'll just start building, and it's in that environment. So, if you're in a large organization, or you're in an organization that's very kind of automation heavy, that's going to be a very large repository of stuff. So getting a handle on that to begin with is a really good idea. The default environment's a very interesting one, and we always come up against.
And I think when you create your Microsoft tenant, you get the default environment that doesn't have Dataverse enabled, right? But you can also enable Dataverse on it. And some organizations have enabled Dataverse on it, and they've got data in there being used with Dataverse. So they potentially have a lot of database usage within their default environment, which then makes it even more difficult to unpick.
Yeah. And as far as I'm aware, when you turn that on, you can't turn it off again. So it's, one of these things is all or nothing. And people have maybe turned it on just out of curiosity without realizing the impact. So you really start to realize the importance of governance and strategy within Power Platform, I think, don't you? And other business areas, IT, you do strategy and you have a governance around your IT in general. So why not the same in Power Platform? And it's such an important thing, whether you're just starting out or kind of at a large enterprise level with no controls in place to get a handle on it. So, I think we've mentioned environments. We're talking about environments today. We want to kind of run through an environment strategy. So where do we begin with that, do you think?
Well, I guess one thing I wanted to bring up is where you mentioned the fact that when, we'll call them a maker, when someone who wants to build something, when they go to Power Platform, that they get put into the default environment automatically. But one thing that we'll talk about later is that doesn't have to happen. You could actually put them into their own environment, their own safe space where they can have a bit more freedom. So that could be part of the environment strategy. We can discuss that a bit later. But let's think about the environments themselves. Like, how do we want to split our organization into different environments? One of the things that we want to consider is application lifecycle management with that. So do we want our makers and our IT projects to be building in an environment and then allowing users to use those apps and flows in that same environment, which means then that those developers are going to be working on something that's potentially live, and they could introduce bugs mistakenly to live applications? Or do we want to have an ALM strategy where they develop an in a development environment, and then they move that through to a testing environment, maybe then through to a pre-production environment, and then through to a production environment. So we want to consider that side of things. I guess this is a good place to say that cost is involved potentially. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think just before we get to the cost side, I just wanted to kind of touch on that kind of application lifecycle management point, right? Because there will be a lot of people that will be coming into this, and they'll not be coming from a traditional software engineering developer background, so they won't really understand the concept of that. But when you start looking into that, even at a very high level, you realize that applications, you don't use the same application that you've developed. You move that application or that solution through development, testing, and production. Ultimately, some steps in between there, maybe depending on organizations, but there is that life cycle, and that's where application lifecycle management comes in. So it makes sense, right? We're typically building applications that are used for business or teams within Power Platforms. It makes sense that it follows that kind of strategy as well. So really important to keep that in mind. So you've got your hand up.
Yes. So I was just going to add to that. So where you were saying about moving your solution from dev to test to production or prod, we're creating copies of the application or copies of the solution as we move it across, right? And one of the really cool things about Power Platform is that when that solution is in production, you can lock it down, can't you? So you've got different types of solutions. You've got unmanaged and managed. Do you want to explain the differences between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the unmanaged environments are where, so unmanaged solutions, you'll get the terminology right. Unmanaged solutions are where we are creating, editing, adding components to a solution. You've got pretty much free form. I need to edit something in a Canvas app or add an action into a Power Automate workflow, then I can do that in an unmanaged solution. But when I get to, say, a managed solution, all of that is locked down. I cannot change any of that in principle. There are some caveats to that, but in principle, you cannot change it once it's in a managed solution. And that's the important kind of factor. You would not want to be editing a solution in production and then break something, particularly if it's like an application or something that's used by hundreds of thousands of users and it suddenly breaks. So that's where the managed solution concept comes in. It's really important to kind of follow that principle when developing, and even getting started. I think it's important, right? If you're going from moving away from personal productivity into team productivity, having an end result that is a managed solution will just be a lot more kind of useful going forward. It allows you to version control. It allows you to kind of make sure that you're not introducing things that you don't want in the end result. So hopefully that explains it in okay terms.
I think that's a great explanation. To add to that, we should cover what a solution really is, right? And I think one of the things that I found confusing when I started learning about Power Platform is that an unmanaged solution is quite different to a managed solution. So I wanted to think of it in terms of boxes. So a solution being a box, and you put things in that box and then you move the box along. But what I came to realize is that boxes doesn't really make sense, because an unmanaged solution just refers to components inside it. So it doesn't actually hold them. So if you delete the solution, you don't delete the components it's referring to. They still remain in your environment. But then when you move that solution or you export that solution as a managed solution, when it then gets imported to your production environment as a managed solution, it then is a box. And if you delete it, everything that was inside it gets deleted at the same time. So I found that concept quite strange to try and think about. But
isn't it?
Yeah. So unmanaged is basically referencing the components inside it. Managed, it's actually holding on to them.
Yeah, I guess the way I like to look at that is if you're building like a a Lego kit, right? You've got all these sub-assemblies, and the sub-assemblies are your components, and you're building that into an actual Lego model, and that's your solution. But if you break all of those bits down, they still exist. They don't disappear. They still exist. So I guess it's a somewhat similar kind of thing, right? So
when it's a managed solution, you're setting it on fire if you delete it.
yeah, exactly. There's no coming back from it. So it's a melted mess on the floor. So it's an important thing, and understanding how a solution works and using a solution is that kind of one of those first steps that really got me thinking, wow, we can do so much more than just build a quick app or a quick workflow, because now we've all of these components in this folder effectively that we can move and share and kind of integrate into more kind of professional practices within an organization. It's a real good concept to learn, get used to.
Mm-hmm. And when people are building in the default environment, typically the majority of the time they're not going to be using solutions, are they? And especially so if Dataverse has not been enabled, because solutions will only be available to you if you have Dataverse enabled, because solutions are stored in Dataverse.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And half the time, we've seen that previously where you go into an organization and they won't even know what Dataverse is, right? So you've just got this sprawl of apps and God knows what else that's just sitting there in the ether, really. So this is where the governance aspect comes in, and where we start to introduce things like Dataverse as a concept. We start to professionalize this a bit more. It goes from just this other tool that we just pick up because I've stumbled across it because I was in SharePoint and I clicked the wrong thing and it took me to Power Apps, to there's a lot more to this. It's a more kind of professional kind of space to work with and actually kind of make things and just see what can be done in terms of automation and transformation, right? So there's lots of layers to it, and the governance allows us to kind of make that a bit more nicer, a bit more governed, and put some of those guardrails in place when you start kind of peeling back the layers on it all.
So with Dataverse, we have one Dataverse instance per environment if Dataverse is enabled. And I guess one of the things I wanted to bring up was the fact that the data that you have in Dataverse, when you're moving your solution across, that data is not going to automatically come with it. So when you're thinking about an environment strategy, it's important to think about the fact that these Dataverse instances are really completely isolated from each other.
Exactly. Yeah. The data doesn't move. It's only really, we call it the schema reference that's moving across. So that's all your columns, any customizations in the forms, the views. It's that stuff that's moving to your next environment, your downstream environment, but any data doesn't. So again, it goes back to that core concept of what an environment is, and these kind of separated workspaces, and not moving data with it or with your solutions is kind of core to that. That's not saying that you can't do it. There are tools that allow you to move the data. It's just, at its kind of principle and solution, you're not doing a data move as part of that.
So when it comes to organizations trying to understand how many environments they should have and what data should be in those environments, do you have any tips or advice as to how to go about planning it?
I think it depends on the organization size, doesn't it? In my opinion, you want to start looking at kind of where you are on that kind of maturity curve, because you might be right at the start of this journey. And at that point, you've got to think, okay, we've just got a default environment. Maybe there's been a few people who have maybe set up a few kind of developer environments that's floating around. There's not really any kind of organization to the chaos. But at the other end of the scale, we've got someone who's in a large enterprise who's a bit more further up the maturity curve, but there isn't any governance around the environment strategy, but there's loads of environments floating around. We've got production environments, we've got lots of production apps and flows going around. So it's trying to bridge and gauge where you are at on that scale. You might be somewhere in between. But if you're at that kind of start, in my mind, I always think, well, we've got the personal developer environments. They're always going to get spun up. We can control them. We can talk about that another time. But where do we begin on that side? And in my mind, it's having at least your test and production instances or environments along with a shared developer environment, so that you can then start to push solutions through a controlled, governed process where at the end result, you've got a locked down solution with a very kind of governed environment that can be used and is going to have minimal risk at the end result. Then on the flip side of it, we've got, like I mentioned, going up that maturity curve, we're then talking about multiple environment layers where we've got maybe production environments that are split out across maybe business area or function. And then you've got obviously the kind of corresponding, dev and test environments for them as well. So you can kind of scale it out, is what I'm trying to get at. From that small kind of starting with 3 environments at core, you can eventually scale it out. Would you agree with that? Or do you think you would start somewhere different on that kind of journey?
Generally agree. And yeah, there's always the consultant's answer if it depends, of course. I think I would agree. I think what I've noticed is that most organizations, for their citizen developers, their makers, they don't have any kind of ALM strategy. So they basically just allow them to build somewhere. Sometimes the default environment, sometimes they give them environments per business unit, but I very rarely see them give them the opportunity to have a test and a production separate from their development, which I think poses a lot of risks for them. So I agree, even from the earliest stage, you really want to split out, at the very least, development and production. So I think that's really important. And yeah, business unit by business unit makes a lot of sense. The thing to consider, I suppose, is how are they collaborating if they are, and how are they sharing data if they are? So it might be that there's an application that spans multiple business units. So it might be that HR need to collaborate with another department in the company, and therefore you might want to spin up an environment for them to perform that collaboration. So it doesn't have to just be that you have these segregated business units, or have you going to do it, or geographical environments as well you can do. But it can be that you spin up environments for specific scenarios as well. And there's no problem with that.
Yeah. And I think you just touched on a really important point there, and around geographical location of environments. Do you just want to talk a little bit about that? Because there is an impact, isn't there? And, if you're creating environments, well, where should you create them, geographically?
Well, geographically, you want to create your environment wherever the people are who are using the environment, of course. That makes sense. And you also have to be careful about laws and regulations. If you're storing data that is sensitive, is it allowed to go outside of certain geographical boundaries as well? So, for instance, with GDPR, you need to know where your data is being stored, and it's very important as to where you choose for it to be stored. You also need to look at the AI settings that you've got, and ensure that you're not sending data outside of that boundary that shouldn't be sent outside of that boundary. But yeah, from a pure performance standpoint, you want to choose those environments that are closest to you, because then you'll get the quickest response from the servers located in those environments.
Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? If you're, if you're creating an environment in the UK and you select US, obviously your traffic has got to go all the way to the US before it can come back to you. So it makes sense that you would maybe look to create in the UK instead, where it's going to be a lot less latency when you're actually using your solutions, and that will be noticeable the further away you kind of create an environment. So yeah, it's important, because you sometimes get those questions, and when you're looking at these things for customers and clients, where should we create them? So it's a good area just to kind of cover. And I think a really good kind of point here that we've not talked about yet is actually around environment security. So we've got all of these environments that, we've maybe created a strategy, we've created environments, it's all looking good. But can I just go in and access all of these environments as a user by default? Or do I need to put some controls in place to actually kind of govern this a bit further?
Well, ideally, you wouldn't be able to get into everything, but we've seen it before. So environments have security roles, and the security roles that you get as standard will depend on whether that environment has Dataverse or not. So if you don't have Dataverse, I believe it's only 2 standard roles you can choose from. I believe it's Environment Maker being one of them, and the other one is environment user or something along those lines. Essentially, you have one role which is more of an administrative role, and you have another role which is just for consuming things within the environment, so opening apps and things like that. Cameo from the cat. And then when you have Dataverse enabled, you have many more security roles, so a copious amount of security roles that you can utilize. In addition to this, you also have security groups that you can use. So the recommended way to do things is to have a security group that's attached to each environment. And then that group manages the control of who can see the environment in the environment listing, as well as get into the environment to start consuming Dataverse or consuming apps, flows, whatever it would be that you give them access to. But you can get extremely granular with your access control, of course. So you can have security groups that are within that parent security group, and they can give access to very specific items within the environment. So you can take it as far as you want to take it. Would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, isn't it? It's already highlighting how granular you can get with security in Power Platform. But on the note of environment security, actually, creating an access group for the environment. What's great about that is you can actually make that an intra group, so that you can actually include that as part of maybe like a user's IT onboarding, so they just get added to that group and they have access to that environment by default. So you can now start to automate some of these things, right? Which is ultimately the goal. We want to automate as much as we can so it becomes as seamless and quick and easy as possible to deal with these many processes. But you're right, when we get that through that front door effectively, if we look at the environment, we go through the front door with that security group into the environment. If we've got Dataverse, we now have a whole bunch of roles that we can apply as to users, to groups. We can apply it to a user level, a team level, a business unit level. This is like groups of teams, groups of users at a business unit level. We can apply it to the entire organization that's actually able to access that environment. So it becomes really multifaceted, and I think worthy of a video itself for how deep and rich the security model can get within Power Platform, particularly with Dataverse. And this is one of the drawbacks, I think, when we start to think about Dataverse versus SharePoint, is that the security model in SharePoint, although it's very good, it's a lot harder to manage, in my opinion, compared to Dataverse, because we've now got to manage those security kind of aspects in SharePoint as well, in a separate service. So, if we're building an app on SharePoint, I now need to think about those SharePoint permissions and making sure that, can the user access the SharePoint site? Can they access a list? Is there any kind of, row level permissions that we need to apply? But in Dataverse, it's a lot more simpler because it's all native in the platform. So yeah, maybe some good kind of points there around Dataverse versus SharePoint. Again, worthy of a video on its own, I think. But you can really start to see how granular permissions and security can get in Power Platform.
One of the things that I wanted to bring up is with regards to the security groups on the environments, and something that people wouldn't necessarily know unless potentially they've been around for a while, which is that if you don't put a security group on an environment, in Dataverse for that environment, you have a users table. And in that users table, you have all of the users who have access to the environment. So if you don't put a security group on the environment, that users table will have everyone in your organization. But if you put a security group on that environment, the users table will only have the people in that security group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good point, because you want to restrict these things as much as possible. You want to follow that principle of least privileged access all the time, and if we can do that within Power Platform. So why not follow that if we can? And it may be a bit daunting to begin with, but you're setting yourself up for success if you're following all of these controls, I think. I guess it leads us on to a kind of good subject, which is we've started to think about our kind of environment strategy and how it could work. But, very rarely are you going into a greenfield Power Platform, estate where there's just nothing there. We're going into these organizations where there's lots of things going on. So how do we get kind of insight into the chaos initially? There must be some tools, right, that we can use to help us just get some initial kind of analytics, reporting, to help us kind of drive our kind of strategy and decisions forward. Do you want to kind of talk about what we can do with that?
Yeah, so there is some information in the Power Platform Admin Center, and over time that information is likely to grow. Microsoft have promised us that in the Power Platform Admin Center, we're ultimately going to be able to have an inventory of absolutely everything within our tenant. And that's going to be amazing. But at the moment, we don't have that. So what we can do is there's the PowerCat team in Microsoft. So they are the Power Customer Advisory team. And they often create pieces of software to test whether there's a desire for something. One of the pieces of software that they created many years ago is called the Center of Excellence Starter Kit. So often in Power Platform and in IT in general, you'll have a Center of Excellence, right? You'll have this team where they're ensuring that there is an amount of excellence in your organization from their team. So they're basically like an admin team. And the Center of Excellence Starter Kit is essentially just a Power Platform solution with some Power BI reports that you import into one of your environments, and then you can use the apps and flows within it to do a huge amount of things. And one of those things is that it can crawl your entire tenant, and it can build up an inventory where you can then see what apps you have, what flows you have, what AI builder models you have, and all of the security roles, all of the environments. You get a huge amount of information from that.
It's a really powerful tool, isn't it? And I would recommend, if anyone who's watching, if you haven't got the starter kit installed, go and do it. Go and start looking into it and getting all of the inventory components in, because you're going to make sense of what's going on. You'll uncover things that you wouldn't even realize by installing it. So it's a really powerful tool in on itself to get you started, and you're then making informed decisions going forward. You can start to build a plan around how to kind of introduce governance in a more robust and scalable way. And what about if you're one of the lucky few that happens to have an organization or be part of an organization that gives Power Platform premium licenses to all its users? Is there something that could be used in that regard?
There is. Before we move on to that, I just wanted to say that the Center of Excellence Starter Kit does require a premium license as well. So it requires, I can't remember what the specifics are right now, but it at the very least requires Power Automate premium license.
Power Automate and Power Apps license for the service account that is installing it. And then users would need a license to access as well, because it's a Dataverse solution. So I believe they would only need a Power App license, though, and any additional Power BI licenses to access the Power BI reports.
Yeah, at the moment, you're not forced to use any AI for it.
Not yet.
Yeah, and yeah, the starter kit, even in quite large organizations, is still very useful. I guess one of the caveats is that if you do have a huge inventory, then there's a chance that the flows might not be able to cope with the amount of data in there. But if we're talking about just several thousand apps and flows, several thousand users, it shouldn't really have a problem with that level of an organization. But if we're talking about hundreds of thousands, then yeah, absolutely, the starter kit's going to ultimately halt. It will try its best, but not manage to do the entire sync. So yeah, we were talking about licenses. So do we need to go into a full discussion on licenses, or do we just want to discuss how licenses impact on environments?
Just how it impacts on environments, I think, right?
For now, yeah.
For now, I think we could again have a full video on licensing. It's such a hotly contested and debated subject. But I think on the impact of environment and planning your strategy, licensing can have a huge impact, right? So what are some of the things that are going to impact your kind of strategy if you have premium licensing and access to that for your users?
So I think the very first thing to mention is the fact that if you want to use Dataverse, you need a license. And that's often the very first point where you would hit upon needing a license. You're wanting to use some form of Dataverse, or you're wanting to use a premium connector in a Power App or a premium connector in Power Automate.
Such a SQL, right? That's quite a common one that people might use outside of the Power Platform world.
Yeah, exactly. Now, one of the things that you can do if you have licenses is you can convert your environment to a managed environment. And this is not to be confused with managed and unmanaged solutions. It's a completely different concept. But essentially, an environment by default will not be considered as managed. And then you can enable it as a managed environment, which will give you a host of premium features that can help you with governance. It can help you with controlling access to the environment, having additional settings. The number of features for managed environments is increasing all the time.
It's almost taking over from the starter kit in a sense, isn't it? I think there's still some gaps there, but I think eventually we'll get to a point where the managed environment concept will be at parity and beyond the starter kit. But I guess it raises a good question maybe for our viewers. Does that mean we can make the default environment a managed environment? And how would that impact things?
We can, although I've never done it before. Do you want to tell me how that would impact on things?
I think it would mean everyone would need a premium license to access it then, right?
Absolutely.
So that's quite a large consideration to think about, but you're going to immediately have a lot more governable kind of solutions, apps and flows in that personal productivity default environment, which otherwise you won't have. So if you are, in an organization that's, pulled the trigger on premium licensing for your user base, then I think that's a very important and relevant thing to think about, is should the default environment be managed? It certainly probably make governance and administration a lot easier, but you then have to make sure everyone has a license to access stuff. So very important to consider. So
my personal opinion on this is that if you can go that route, it does make sense. And I'll give my reasons why. So in an ideal world, you would use what's called environment routing. And this is a feature of managed environments only. So this is a premium feature. And this is where when someone goes to build something in Power Apps or Power Automate, I think potentially also Copilot Studio, you'll automatically get routed to your own developer environment. So this is your environment that is owned by you. You are the named user as the owner. You're a system administrator in the environment. So you can pretty much do what you want within reason. We should probably talk about DLP policies at some point, because that does impact on things. But essentially, you're given your own environment with some freedom, and you can start building things. And in that environment is where you should be building things but not sharing things. So if that's a managed environment, from a governance perspective, we can put some controls on that so that you can't share things to a great degree in that environment. We might decide you can share with up to 5 users because you want some people to be able to collaborate with you or something along those lines. So I think the argument for making the default environment is the same as for making developer environments managed as well, or being able to control developer environments. And that's because you can then control the sharing on it. So if we're saying that the default environment is for personal productivity, well, let's not let them share their Canvas apps with anyone. Just keep it to yourself. And the same with their flows. And then we're guaranteeing that their Canvas apps and their flows are for personal productivity.
That's really powerful, isn't it? I mean, just thinking from the point of view of a maker that's not interested or, doesn't really care about all the administration or what environment they're in. They just go to make.powerapps.com and just start building an app. And, that environment routing just takes all of that kind of guesswork out of it. They're just going to be routed directly to their own environment, their own kind of air-gapped kind of workspace. It's not going to impact anything, but already we can put some of these stricter controls on to make sure that they don't add the wrong connector, they don't accidentally send out the company's financial reports for the past year to their own Gmail or something like that. So it becomes really, really powerful when we start to look at it from that point. And I guess in my mind as well, the environment routing goes hand in hand with the environment grouping aspect, right? So this is how we start to create a bit of organization with the chaos, okay? So we've got the environment strategy, we know how things should go through application lifecycle management kind of process, but to actually get a bit more kind of organization around that, that's where the environment grouping comes in, and that's where we can actually just have effectively like folders of environments, right? So we can see, well, our developer environments go into a group, and that's, so they're all, exactly what they are. All our production environments go into a group, all our test environments go into a group. So we can now see exactly where on a kind of a map effectively where everything is, and it becomes a lot easier to manage. And I think you can provide kind of controls on the group level as well to make this even easier to manage. So again, when you start to think about premium licensing, you're starting to think about all of these additional features that are really, really useful in that kind of governance and enablement journey.
Yeah, so I said before that in a developer environment, that developer has system administrator access, which is a very powerful security role because it means that you can go into the admin center for your environment and you can change any setting.
Keys to the kingdom, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. But the moment that gets put into an environment group, there are currently 20 rules that you can set for environment groups, and it's going to grow over time. And these rules will override whatever that business maker, that citizen developer wants to do in their developer environment. So if you don't want them to be able to turn on the ability to, say, use PCF components, PCF controls, which are pure code JavaScript, TypeScript controls, which potentially pose a risk to your organization. So when it comes to citizen developers, people who aren't that tech savvy, potentially, you want that feature to be turned off, and you do not want them to have the ability to turn that on. With an environment group, that's no problem. You set this rule to say you cannot turn that on, and you publish it, and they will not be able to, even though they have that system admin power inside of their own environment. So managed environments, environment groups and environment routing, all together, they start to become this incredibly powerful governance tool that if you don't have them, you're going to really struggle to maintain, to keep a reduced amount of risk within your ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So let's say that you imagine you don't have environment groups and you have an environment where a maker has system administrator as their security role. They can do anything they want. And the only way to stop them from doing that would be to maybe create your own automation that automatically checks all of the settings every day and turns them off if they've been turned on or something along those lines. Well, there's going to be room for error there, of course, because you can't check them every second. And if you're checking a day later, what has happened within the 24 hours where you haven't checked it?
Yeah. And I think this is something that what we're hoping to do with our viewers is kind of help them build a case, right? To say, this is why premium licensing is going to have such a positive and beneficial impact on the governance standpoint. You wouldn't skip on security. So why are you doing it in Power Platform? And hopefully we can help our viewers on that journey to build a case up as we go through this series. So I'm personally really looking forward to helping them build that case up.
So that's a case for premium licensing from an environment perspective, but we can also provide information on building up that case from an app perspective or just generally building things in Power Platform. The fact that you get AI capabilities by default, you get additional database capacity by default, the fact that you get Power Pages capabilities through having licenses. There are 101 reasons why licenses can be useful.
Thank you for watching. In our next video, we're going to be covering the tenant level settings in the admin center and best practices with them. Quick question for you. How are you handling your environment strategy? Do drop a comment and your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.